Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world right now, and welcome to this PHAP online briefing. My name is Marcus Forsberg, and I'm Collaboration Center Manager with PHAP, which most of you know already stands for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, and I will be your facilitator for today's event. So in today's session, we will be taking a critical look at the concept of humanitarian futures and also get an introduction to a new set of tools for organizations wanting to use this in their strategic planning. This event is made possible through the Geneva Humanitarian Connector, an initiative of PHAP supported by the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. So with that, let's now focus on the substance of today's event. We will be exploring then the concept of humanitarian futures and how this can be used by humanitarian organizations to deal with the ever-increasing complexity and uncertainty that organizations find themselves in today and in the future. So our speakers today will be presenting the recently launched Humanitarian Futures platform, which offers a new set of tools developed for humanitarian actors to be more adaptive, anticipatory, innovative, collaborative, and lead on any upcoming change in the humanitarian landscape. So just to briefly introduce today's panelists, we will be joined by three guest experts today. Beris Gwynn sitting here with me today in Geneva. Beris is a former Australian diplomat and aid official and served as the director of World Vision International's Geneva office from 2011 to 2016. At the end of January 2016, Beris launched her own platform called Incitare to support greater engagement with strategic foresight and futures thinking, and has been brokering innovative and accountable multi-stakeholder partnerships to accelerate achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So very happy to have you here, Beris. Beris will introduce us to the current and increasing importance of thinking about humanitarian futures. Then, connecting from the UK, Randolph Kent was a senior official with the UN in emergency operations in Ethiopia, Sudan, Rwanda, Kosovo, and Somalia, after which he moved out of operations to become director of the Humanitarian Futures program at King's College. He now directs the Humanitarian Futures platform, which he will present today together with his colleague Joanne Burke. So then finally, also connecting from the UK, Joanne is currently project consultant for the Humanitarian Futures platform. Prior to that, she also worked for the Planning from the Future project at King's College. Her employment experience includes several years with UNDP, as well as experience working in the private sector, international NGOs, and in USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. So then first over to Beris to introduce the topic. Beris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Hello, everyone. In a number of meetings that I've attended in recent times on strategic foresight and futures thinking, there's been, among some in the audience, a concern that this is just another buzzword, just the latest fad, just something else that we're going to entertain ourselves with without focusing on the real issues or actually changing anything that needs to be done. So my first question to open this, I think, really seminal webinar this afternoon is why the buzz? Some of us have been around for a number of years, and we've seen the succession of United Nations and other conferences, all of them worthy, producing enormous amounts of material, recommendations, and so on. And I think it's only been in the last 5 years that with the succession of events, particularly linked to the consultations on Agenda 2030, climate change conference, the Humanitarian Summit, and so on, that we have finally realized that we are being overtaken by the increasing complexity that faces us and the accelerating speed of change. What has become increasingly apparent, and government, UN, NGO leaders and others, including private sector leaders, have recognized that the current set of institutions, processes, tools and techniques are not up to the task. In fact, not only are they deficient in terms of what we need to be able to accomplish if we have any chance of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, to some extent, the current system builds in perverse incentives that reward old kinds of behaviour and inhibit our ability to be really free-thinking and to be creative and to design and implement new ways of working, new ways of mobilizing resources. In the last 3 years, there have been a number of events here in Geneva focusing on futures, and the consensus that has emerged from those meetings has underlined the urgent need for fresh thinking, that our usual approaches, which are linear and incremental, are simply not going to be sufficient. And it's in that regard that our opening up longer-term views, both retrospective, re-examining history, but also looking forward, we create a space to test our assumptions about the way the world is and to question the capacity of the existing processes to achieve the goals that we have set. In these same events, with participants from UN agencies, from across the NGO community, from academic institutions and the private sector, one of the surprises for people has been the reinforcement of the idea of human agency. So apart from the tiredness that's reflected in the question, why the buzz, I think we've in some ways been overwhelmed ourselves by the sense of how difficult the task is and how poor our efforts seem to be in comparison with what's required. So to conclude those brief words of introduction, it's really a privilege for me to be a partner of the Humanitarian Futures platform here in Geneva. And I'd just like to give credit to Randolph and Joanne, who have really invested a huge amount of time and effort in what they see, I'm sure, as a public good. They have taken a highly professional approach to this work. They've tested it. They are keen to continue to test and to improve it. And it's my pleasure now to be able to hand over to Randolph, who will begin the presentation on the Humanitarian Futures platform. Randolph, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I am so very grateful that we have someone of your wealth of experience and depth of understanding to introduce this. In presenting Humanitarian Futures, let me emphasize that no one can or should ignore the horrors of the present. The Rohingya refugees fleeing to Bangladesh, the forgotten in Puerto Rico, Syrian refugees and the plight of the war-torn people of Yemen, the enduring consequences of Fukushima tsunami, the list seems endless, and the challenges of the present seemingly overwhelming. And yet those with humanitarian roles and responsibilities also cannot ignore the emerging reality that the types, dimensions, and dynamics of emerging crisis drivers may well result in humanitarian crises that could far exceed the horrors even of the present. Such crisis drivers could challenge the duration of a crisis, could require responses and methods that have little relationship to the instruments of the present, and could have threats which for many parts of the world might even be existential. Take, for example, the consequences of the loss of cyber systems. More and more cyber systems are linked into the daily needs of billions of people. In 2020, there will be at least 6.1 billion people who own or have direct access to mobile phones out of a population of just over 7 billion. Rural as well as urban systems, the very poor as well as the wealthy, will depend upon cyber systems for receiving money, for offering health care via telemedicine and tactile communications, for education, for identifying water sources in an ever more drought-prone region. And equally as important, cyber systems will be essential for maintaining the infrastructures upon which the poor as well as the wealthy will increasingly depend. Ports, banks, transportation, communication, all systems upon which societies at every level will become increasingly dependent. And now bear in mind that cyber systems will increasingly be based in outer space. Outer space, vulnerable to a growing volumes of space debris, meteors, and dare I say, the malicious intents of other powers with outer space capacity. When such outer space-based cyber systems go down, vast numbers of people will be affected, and the systems upon which they will increasingly intensify their vulnerability. The sheer complexity, the types of vulnerabilities and extent of impacts will generally transcend anything that those with humanitarian roles and responsibilities have had to contend with to date. And this specter leads me to this question of what are the kinds of humanitarian capacities challenged that we should be sensitive to. Here, let me begin with the point that all too often there's a reluctance amongst most policymakers and decision makers to see humanitarian crises as complex phenomena. That butterfly that flaps its wings and which eventually results in a tsunami. What are the complex variables that have led from one to the other? In other words, the reluctance of most policy planners and decision makers to see crises as complex phenomena, comprising many interactive crisis drivers occurring simultaneously or sequentially. All too often, crises are assessed as single-issue occurrences, their impacts analyzed in isolation. Even when attempting to anticipate the future, analysts as well as policy planners and decision makers have a tendency to focus on the consequence of a single set of transformative factors. This tendency, too, ignores the reality that such factors will inevitably be part of a complex system of issues so tightly bound that they are inseparable, as are their consequences. The second concern for me that I put under humanitarian capacities challenge is this kind of over-reliance on probability impact calculation. Low probability, high impact, and vice versa are convenient ways to categorize, but have increasingly less relevance in a global community of ever more rapid and unpredictable change. And to some extent, this too is linked to the unrelenting insistence on evidence-based analysis. Too often, rarely answered in such circumstances about evidence-based analysis is what kind of objectivity defines evidence. Swans or completely unprecedented and unforeseen event. And those, back again, flapping butterfly wings or a small change in one state of a nonlinear system. Such analysis, such insistence on evidence-based analysis can limit the types of interactions and approaches needed to identify complex factors that are creating and that will create humanitarian crises. And then if I may just spend 1 second on what I think is also possibly recognizable by some, and that is the unflagging logic of what we've called comfort zone. The recipients of futures-related thinking, including decision makers and policy makers, are all too reluctant to go beyond the immediate. The world described as their comfort zone. It's been said that for public sector officials, often the challenge isn't lack of vision, but short time frames, competing priorities, and flawed delivery. And even for those willing to speculate about the future, there's a reluctance to do so if it might, dare I say, antagonize potential funders. All too often, innovations and innovative thinking are introduced only as desperate alternatives when a system begins to collapse, when it fails, rather than at a time when the system is functioning well, to apply well-considered transformation. To some extent, this explains why even faced with factors that clearly have transformative potential, the reluctance to go beyond the incremental adjustment means that true transformation is missed. This is a challenge to the humanitarian sector. Now, what I'd like to do, if I may, is to just go over 5 capacities that we feel are very relevant to the kind of challenges that I mentioned, the kind of issues which Barris introduced, and this under the heading of 5 capacities. None of these 5 capacities will be new for you. But what we want to do is to put it in such a way that these 5 capacities begin to stretch, if you like, your comfort zone. Let me begin with this issue of anticipation, constantly monitoring. NGO constraints about anticipation also have more general parallels with other organizations. 3 very large consultancy firms recently told me that their private sector clients were willing to explore longer-term perspectives as long as futures adjustments did not run contrary to their overall business model. The constraints on efforts to anticipate the what might be's will come as no surprise to those in most organizations. And yet, as organizations in Silicon Valley have demonstrated, resistance to more speculative approaches to pursuing objectives and strategies can be overcome. The key is an ethos that pervades the organization of anticipation, an organizational commitment, fostering and promoting value in speculating about the what might be. The commitment to search for new ideas, the willingness to accept failures as a possible consequence of experimentation, and the acceptance that at the present rate of change, the future is now, are all steps towards an anticipatory organization. I wondered now if we could go to this whole question of adaptation. I recall reading a book by a former force commander of the Iraq Task Force in 2004. And he began to say, you know, we had the largest army. We had the best equipment. We had extraordinary gadgets. And we thought we had the most tremendous kind of intelligence, and yet we always missed the enemy. And from the force commander's point of view, the failure he was encountering stemmed from the Army's adherence to conventional institutional structures. Every information, every form of technological change, every gadget was in one way or another linked to the organization's standard operating procedures. No matter how complex, no matter how different the situation, one way or another, they could all be squeezed into a standard repertoire, the way we've always done things, standard operating procedure. And here, too, we have a capacity, adaptation, that needs to be further developed. And similarly, innovation. And by the way, I mean, it is very important to stress that the humanitarian sector has not been devoid of innovation. In fact, if you think about it, one of the most enduring symbols of the humanitarian sector, namely the Red Cross, was indeed an innovation. And there can be little doubt that what has been described as digital humanitarians and cash transfers have been profoundly transformative in so many ways. The list of innovations is perhaps longer than some critics of the humanitarian sector would acknowledge. Yet, nevertheless, there are many areas where the humanitarian sector has failed to be as innovative as it could or should be. Ever more complex crises will demand innovative practices and innovations that will have to keep pace with unprecedented technological and societal change. Advances in technology have always disrupted the status quo, but they have never done so across so many sectors and at the speed and scale that we are seeing today. And by the way, probably you all feel that today is merely a foretaste of the speed of change in the foreseeable future. Hence, the point I'm making is that innovation, yes, and the humanitarian sector has been innovative indeed, but in a sense, it's been inherently haphazard, and frequently hesitant approaches to innovation have often failed to keep pace with the kind of types of crises that only true innovation might have been able to deal with. For us, as with effective anticipation and adaptation that has to pervade the ethos of an organization, so too must the search for testing and the application of innovation not be haphazard, not be random, not be by chance, but has to be at the core of an organization's DNA. The search for innovation has to be part of a continuous process inherent in an organization that really is looking for ways to meet the challenges of the future. With that in mind, let me also turn to the issue of collaboration. Less and less will humanitarian collaboration be solely defined by humanitarian actors, and more by the growing number of peoples and institutions that will find themselves increasingly vulnerable to ever more complex crisis drivers and crises. A cybernetic failure, superbugs, bioengineered pandemic, robotic-driven unemployment, and the unrelenting effects of climate change may all create vulnerabilities that could change the nature, types, and dimensions of the affected. And the affected in this context may well involve the private sector, may well involve other institutions that are not normally those to whom the humanitarian seeks to assist. This issue of north-south divides and socioeconomic divisions may be less and less the factor, and more the very institutions that keep societies going, that try and ameliorate north-south crises, the vulnerability crises, may themselves, such as the private sector, such as the military, become vulnerable and at the same time become potential collaborators, partners of the more traditional humanitarian sector. And here, the challenge for the humanitarian sector, as well as those outside the humanitarian sector faced with the humanitarian crises, is see how do we determine comparative advantages of those who together have to address such crises. How do we assess their value added when we, to try and deal with a true capacity challenge, need to rely on each other across sectors? How do we determine what they have to offer? How do they determine our value add? Finally, I just want to mention the issue of leadership, because in so many ways, leadership may often or not be felt to be the glue that brings together those factors essential for effective organizations in the future. In and of itself, the importance of leadership will be probably no surprise to anyone. What may be more of a surprise could be the ways that changes in organizational dynamics, the increasingly diverse forms of cyberspace, the rapid speed of information exchange, and the consequences of atomization may affect in various ways the very definition of leadership and its expectation. Away from the hierarchy of conventional leadership, no longer the heroic hands-on leader, we will be looking for and depending upon for the organization of the future, for the humanitarian organization committed to dealing with the future, different types of leadership. The leader may be eyes on, but hands off. Decisions and relevant strategies might be decided as a single group or by sets of groups, but not necessarily by, quote unquote, that man on the white horse. Even the assumption that a leader works within the context of defined organizational parameters and with people who work solely for that organization is questionable if you look at the future's context. Shared leadership and the variety of other terms that are increasingly relevant in terms of the future. Still, however, does not mean that one dispenses with the individual leader. It just means that leadership will require leaders to be more facilitated, less directed. Along with transformative changes will become profound organizational change, which in this instance means that hierarchical leadership will be replaced by self and self-governing groups or teams that will distribute tasks amongst themselves. Planning, prioritizing, performance, evaluation, and decision-making. We have to think about leaders that are monitors, that are ultimately mentors, the new leadership paradigm. Now, having said all of this, and I hope that the issue of humanitarian capacities challenge is clear. I hope that the kind of capacities that we are suggesting make sense. But how does one begin to develop it? How does one sensitize the organization to these kind of concerns and these kind of issues? Bring together what we call our toolkit, and for which we have replied so much on the ability, work, and experience of my colleague, Joanne Burke. Joanne, over to you.
Randolph, if I may just interrupt a little bit in between here. We'll have time for more Q&A at the end, but maybe just a few clarifications on questions that have come in from participants during your presentation here. So first, it's clear that participants find a futures approach very important. We saw in an earlier poll participants bringing up issues of local ownership, technological change, and collaboration and coordination needs as major factors driving what they say as a need to look at a different approach for how to strategically approach these issues. But when you brought up the fact that policy planners don't have a willingness to see humanitarian crises as complex crises, we saw a bit of a split in that poll we had up with a small majority of participants thinking that policy planners are willing to see humanitarian crisis as complex. So I'm just wondering if you could expand a bit on that, if the issue might be more around the capacities of what to, even if they are willing to see it as complex, what they can do with that attitude. And maybe just bring up William in the chat also brought up, for example, big data, the lack of big data in early stages really hampering strategic thoughts and approaches to humanitarian crises. Maybe a little bit more on that, if you would.
And both, may I just say, both are really very, very important questions. Let me just take the first. You know, the real issue for me when I talk about policy planners, and by the way, if I look at the numbers of you that are listening to this, I hope that you're not all policy planners. But if you are, then my question to you is this. Of course, policy planners think about the future. My concern, however, is how you think about the future. Do you sort of relate what you might call the probability of an event to all the kind of complex factors that might not normally be in the conventional interpretation of how an event might occur? So in other words, what I'm really trying to say is, how wide do you search for your understanding of the future? Who defines your understanding of the future? What do you mean by the future? And you know, one of the things, if I may, and now this goes with my experience with the humanitarian sector, principally from a intergovernmental point of view. What also always fascinates me is when I talk about the future, is they say, of course we think about the future. We have 5-year programs. I'm talking about futures that one has to prepare for over a 2-decade perspective. It's not about the futures in a 5-year perspective. It is about preparing now for a kind of perspective that goes well beyond that. The second thing is, if I understood the question right, the whole issue of big data. I think to some extent what really fascinates me, and which I should have emphasized more, but when I talked about innovation, and Barris reminded me of this the other day, the opportunities that we have to use these kind of innovations to offset crises cannot be ignored. Big data is just one of those that can help us anticipate types of crises that we've never thought about before, as well, by the way, as robotics and related innovation. So if I got the question right, we have not been able to effectively use big data as yet, but we certainly should be looking towards that end to help us define not merely how to anticipate complex crises, but also how to resolve them. Marcus, I hope that makes some sense.
Definitely. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, maybe 2 short questions of clarification further here. So Agnes in Switzerland brings up what you mentioned about evidence-based analysis and wondered if you could clarify what it is that makes this problematic and what you would propose instead. So that's on the one hand. And then specifically about the capacity for innovation, we got in several comments there on the risks of focusing too much on innovation. So maybe you could quickly comment on that. Michelle, for example, brought up in the chat the risk of losing sight of a human understanding by focusing too much on innovation. And Adam, while agreeing with focusing on innovation, warning against debasing it as standard operating procedures rather than true innovation. Maybe a few words on those 2 clarifications before moving on.
Marcus, let me just be very quick. And when the question about evidence-based was raised, I thought, oh my God, maybe I ought to take a look at my university thesis and see if I was adequately evidence-based. However, having said that, what really worries me about evidence-based, and I've seen this when it comes to innovations presented, or project proposals presented to governments, as well as, if you like, agents of governments, is that unless you can prove that this is going to be an outcome, I don't want to invest in your proposal, into your project. That's what concerns me about evidence-based. I do not have specific evidence for the what might be's. I am out there to try and see complexity that is untested. There is no past evidence which I can bring to this. All I can say is that exploring will give some context. If you draw me to the past, and if you say that only the past is the evidence that will determine the uncertainties about the future, then I think we are, if you like, caught in the evidence-based trap. Now, in terms of this whole question of innovation and risk, I mean, there are two things. One is, what fascinates me is how those organizations, and here it's a bit obvious, but there are organizations in what I call, quote-unquote, Silicon Valley who are willing to take the risk and generally quite successful. But I think the real question for me is this whole question of the human understanding. Let me go back to Rwanda very briefly. 1995, 1994, 95, we tried to, if you like, respond relatively effectively. We dumped in food, we dumped in clothing, shelter, etc., the standard operating commodities of conventional humanitarian response at the time. But we had just bore witness to 800,000 human beings killed in a matter of 3 months. And by innovation here, 2 points come out. What did we know about psychological practices, social psychological practices that could really begin to add some meaning to people's lives in that genocide-torn country? That's innovation. That's innovation that actually is inherent, is designed to try and help us understand humankind. So that is certainly an example that comes to mind. And I do not think that one has to divorce the search for innovation from the ways that we can enhance our capacities to help people. Thanks, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Randolph. And just to follow up a little bit on that evidence-based approach point, we recently did a full webinar just discussing that issue, and maybe Liz can put up a link to the recording of that for those who are interested more in that discussion as well. But that's it on the clarification side, and I'll hand over the floor then to Joanne to introduce the platform.
First of all, I just want to say thank you all for joining. It's great to see such a diverse mix of backgrounds and viewpoints coming out, and really important questions that you're all asking. Before I go in, I'm going to talk about what's in the toolkit. But I think it is important to say, by way of background, a bit about, where did these tools come from? Randolph started the Humanitarian Futures program in 2004, and I worked with him in the later years on it. And one of the things that we consistently heard and discussed amongst ourselves was, over the years in our work with different humanitarian actors, we felt that, people, they very well understood, the same as you're demonstrating today, that the bigger landscape is becoming more complex, that the past is not necessarily a predictor for the future, and that they need to think differently about capacity for the future. That said, practically speaking, they were really unsure how to change, what they could do or what their organizations needed to do to reduce the types of barriers that Randolph has noted, and to respond more effectively to a more uncertain and more complex crisis landscape. And we recognize that this is really difficult. We're not saying that it's easy, but I think this led us to the development and testing of these tools. So we did a lot of work. We developed them, and they've been tested in the work that we did over the years. And now in the last year, we've been doing a lot of work to get them ready so that they can go out and be accessible by a much bigger audience, and available for further use, for further adaptation, and for further development by people like yourselves who are listening to this webinar today, as well as by others. So the slide I have here now is, when you go to the Humanitarian Futures platform and you click on the HF toolkit, this is what you'll see when you go into that section of the web page. And you'll see across the top that there are 5 tabs that comprise the toolkit. There's the Introduction to the Toolkit, Futures Roundtable, Testing the Future, the Fergana Valley Scenario, and the Organizational Self-Assessment Tool. So these are what I'm going to speak about now very briefly. As I indicated, all 4 tools have been tried and tested. Each time, the results of the various tests have been incorporated into the tools packages. The tools have all been peer-reviewed as well, and we thank Beres for all the great work that she did in helping us with the review and the peer review of some of the tools. So I think it's really important to say is that we see this whole thing very much as a dynamic and an ongoing process. And the tools are not meant to be static tools. They're open source tools, so we welcome your help in further testing and further refining them, and also to, learning about the tools that you have that you've used and maybe developed that we don't necessarily know about. Each tool has a very distinct purpose, focus, and target audience that I'm going to speak about. And all the tools have a strong focus on what is meant by humanitarian futures. They are all meant to be used for capacity enhancement and to help introduce and reinforce this idea that Barris mentioned in her opening comments about fresh thinking, new approaches and fresh thinking, and to encourage more exchange between all of us about how we're approaching the future and how we're thinking about addressing longer-term threats. Now, all four of the tools are designed in a way that they can be done as used in a standalone basis, but they can also be used in sequence or they can be used in tandem with each other. So we encourage you to experiment with using them, and we would be most interested in any feedback that you have once you do use them. All the tools, and you'll see when you go into the respective tool packages, they all require somebody to be a lead organizer. We refer to this individual as a host, and preferably it will be somebody who has some sort of a senior level position, who has the working in a role that would enable them to say, I think we should try this. I think this could really help us. There are no ready-made answers for what should come out of it. As was a result of trying one of the tools, maybe we'll understand futures better. Maybe we'll have a better agreement inside about what we mean by complexity. Maybe we'll have a better agreement inside about, for our organization, how long are we talking about when we're talking about longer-term threats. So, as I said, I think that then now probably what we would recommend is that you start in this section here, which is the introduction to the HF Toolkit, which is your starting place for familiarizing yourself with the different tools. And this introduction provides you with an overview of the tools and can serve as a roadmap for decision-making for you to decide which tools would be most relevant and useful to you in your work. Now, the first tool that I'm going to talk about is the Futures Roundtable. And that is, we actually call that the FRE. And the FRE is intended for those who have a leadership role in a humanitarian organization that requires them to think about things about organizational strategy, about organizational policy, about organizational design. The FRE is a 1.5-day event that brings together senior-level humanitarian practitioners with thematic experts from the natural and social sciences. These thematic experts are individuals primarily outside the humanitarian sector who, due to the nature of their work, are required to think about and have a concept of a future world. So if these individuals might work in artificial intelligence, they might work in nanotechnology, they might work in futures research. These thematic experts in the event actually suggest what a future or multiple futures could look like in X number of years' time, and the types of disruptors that will drive that will drive these different futures related to social, technological, environmental, economic, and political megatrends. So as humanitarian experts listen to this, they helps them then think about and consider what would be the crisis implications of these different megatrends, and what would the implications of this what might they be in terms of their organizational current thinking, the way that they develop strategy, the way that they think about their business models, the way that they think about developing or adapting their organizational processes. And the event provides the opportunity for humanitarians together to explore what they can do now to start to prepare for longer-term change. So we've had really very good feedback from the tests that we've run so far, and particularly the humanitarian actors thought that they really appreciated having the opportunity to interact with thematic experts outside the sector, but also to be able to engage with peers to explore how to incorporate the longer term and the 5 capacities into their strategy and policy setting processes. And I think we found this throughout this finding that we had, particularly for the FRE, but also for the other tools, is these tools, at least in our experience, have provided an immensely beneficial opportunity for people to disengage from the day-to-day pressures of their work, because one of the findings that we had consistently in the Humanitarian Futures work was that there just isn't the time and the space for people to be able to sit and to reflect and to talk and to speculate and think about the longer term in a somewhat of a structured way. So this was really important feedback that we had from all of the tools, but particularly from the Futures Roundtable event. Okay, and now the next one is the what we call testing the future. And testing the future is designed to be used with a single humanitarian organization. The FRE, as I said, brought together senior humanitarian level practitioners from different organizations. So testing is designed to be used by one humanitarian organization. And this exercise targets middle-level personnel, including those working with strategy, programming, and operational roles, as well as those who might work in learning and development, or knowledge management, or monitoring and evaluation. It's a 2-part meeting exercise, which we see is designed to introduce, and we say seed, or plant seeds about the idea of futures in relation to the work of a humanitarian actors and their organization. The exercise has, particularly the second part of the exercise, has a very strong focus on what it means for an organization to be fit for the future. And the exercise doesn't tell people what that is. That idea about what it means for an organization to be fit for the future comes from the participants. And they exchange perspectives on specific measures and steps that their organization is taking or could be taking to enhance its capacity to prepare for the longer term. And these relate very much to, not just exclusively to the capacities that Randolph has spoken about, but a lot of it is anchored around discussion around those 5 capacities. The exercise also offers participants the opportunity to practice using selected futures techniques that can help them understand and consider futures in a very practical as well as a structured manner, and it introduces techniques that they can take back into their organization. Of particular benefit to participants was having, again, as I said with the Futures Roundtable, this space, to come together with their peers and sit and detach from the day-to-day pressures of their jobs, and be able to engage in a discussion similar to what we're doing now about how is the world changing? How are crisis events becoming more complex and uncertain? What does that mean? What are we experiencing? What changes are we seeing? This is a hugely valuable opportunity, and these tools create the space for you to have these kinds of conversations inside your organization. Okay, the next tool is what we call the Fergana Valley scenario exercise. And the origin of this came from a lot of work, also a supplemental work that we did in the HFP, looking at the growing involvement and progressive involvement of actors outside the humanitarian involved in crisis events. And this trend we felt really began, pretty much since 2004 with the Indian Ocean tsunami. And it's progressively built, and so we really thought this was a big feature of the work that we did, to the point now where I think most people would agree that cross-sector collaboration is now widely viewed as being very central to the humanitarian sector and to humanitarian action. So while joint engagement generates many positive benefits and many positive opportunities, at the same time, there are also many barriers and challenges that can arise related to collaboration between sometimes actors within the sector, but certainly between actors from within the humanitarian sector and outside the sector. And I did a lot of work looking at this kind of engagement, and we found that there were numerous barriers related to how do you understand what each other's motives are, how do we understand each other's terminology, how do we decide who is best suited to do what, and how do we have different maybe time frames for engagement that are difficult to reconcile. So we developed the Fergana Valley scenario exercise as a way to, serve kind of as to help bridge the collaboration divide between different sectors. So this is a 1.5-day simulation event that brings together humanitarian actors with those from the military, from the private sector, and from the sciences. And again, feedback from conducting this exercise has really always emphasized how effectively it helps humanitarian actors as well as actors outside the sector be much more attuned to the importance of being able to assess who has what added value and who has what comparative advantage and who is best suited to do what. Because this is a lot of what is addressed in the exercise and a lot of what it comes out. This is what they have to address as part of the simulation. And it also, the exercise is also, we've had feedback we've had is that it helps enormously with the recognition that when you're going to collaborate, even within your own organization or with another humanitarian organization, and certainly with actors outside the sector, having a good relationship and having a good understanding of who's at the table is really critical and very, very important. So this exercise also helps a lot with this and helps actors when they're going to engage together to establish collective outcomes and to be able to, tap into each other's resources and expertise in a positive way. So that's the Fergana Valley scenario. And the next one is, the final one is what we call the OSAT. And the OSAT is a self-assessment, sorry, hold on, I'm going to go back, excuse me. Okay, the OSAT, here we are. The OSAT is it's a self-assessment questionnaire that's designed to be completed by individuals. So you see that the tools kind of have a mix of different things. Some is bringing humanitarian practitioners together, some is more for an organization, some is more for a mixed group, and then this one is designed to be used by individuals. And that can be, primarily we used it in the context of one organization. So the questionnaire has a dual focus. The first one is looking at how people perceive longer-term threats. And the second focus is, based on those longer-term threats, how do the respondents perceive the strengths and weaknesses of their organization's capacity to deal with such threats? So we use this questionnaire very widely in the work that we did over the years in very diverse organizational and geographic contexts. And again, I want to say that people really enjoy taking it and having the opportunity then to participate in discussing the results, maybe with their peers, maybe within their peers in their department, maybe it was with a slice of people from across the organization, maybe it was with a headquarters office and a regional office, and being able to, discuss the results and from that then identify actions for capacity enhancement that they think will help them improve their capacity to be more attuned to longer-term threats and to be able to respond to them. So again, the OSAT can be used as a standalone tool, or it can be used in tandem with any of the other three tools. And it's a really useful tool for introducing, terminology and concepts about what do we mean by humanitarian futures and what is this thing that we're talking about what futures capability is. So that in a nutshell is the HF toolkit, and the website is live now, so you can go on and click on the HF toolkit, and you can then very much, I think, take your time and get familiar with what's in there and see which is of interest to you and see which might be of benefit to your own work and that of your organization. So I hope this overview has been helpful and at least given you a flavor of what's in there. But as I said, you'd want to go on to the website and you'll be able to navigate that in much more detail than this brief overview that I've given you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for that very useful overview. And as Liz mentioned in the chat, PHAP will also be organizing a workshop. I'll mention a little bit more about that at the end, but to give people more of an idea about these tools. We'll have a little bit of a general Q&A coming up here, but first a couple of clarifications directly on the tools, if you don't mind, Joanne. So first, specifically on the Futures Roundtable, we had a few comments coming in from Florence and Adrian, thinking this sounds more like a normal scenario planning and context analysis exercise that are being done routinely by NGOs now. How is this different from what many NGOs are doing internally for scenarios and context analysis?
We wouldn't call it a scenarios exercise. There is an element in the Futures Roundtable when it towards the end of the first day. It's a day-and-a-half exercise. That the exercise starts with the different thematic experts from outside the sector who are there, speaking from their discipline about how they think the world might look in X number of years. And from that analysis, then, they develop what we call a set of global portraits about the world. One way the world could look would be this way, another way the world could look is that way, and another way is this way. And then that becomes the basis for a much broader discussion with the humanitarians about what are the crisis implications of, both in terms of the future projections that the thematic experts make, as well as what these portraits might look like. So, and then from there, the discussion really then flips over to the humanitarian actors themselves, talking about the crisis implications and talking about this in the context of the work of their own organizations and what the implications of this might be for the business models and their business models, for strategy formulation and adaptation, for policy setting, for organizational change. So it has elements of maybe some of what you're talking about, but it's quite different. And the basic methodology, at least for part of the first day, which is very important, and then comes back again the second day, is you're probably, a lot of you are familiar with the fishbowl methodology, whereby the thematic experts speak to themselves pretty much the first day with the humanitarians listening, and then the roles get reversed afterwards. So I think if you go into the website and you go into the toolkit and you look at the FRE, that will help you get a better sense of, and there might be elements in what you're talking about that could be beneficial to the Futures Roundtable exercise if you were going to use it.
Perfect. Thanks, Joanne. Darius, you already engaged a bit in this discussion in the chat here, I see. But maybe quickly over to you on this point as well, and maybe if you could also address the issue raised by Florence about that we need to have a measure of humility when talking about humanitarian organizations, especially NGOs, as it's the role of the state to deal with these issues primarily, and NGOs need to be focusing on what they can realistically do. Darius, over to you.
Thanks very much, Marcus. First, I'd like to reinforce the humility line by reminding everyone of comments that were made earlier about how there are no right or wrong answers or right or wrong approaches in Futures work, because none of us know. And that's why I think it might have been Randolph or Joanne who mentioned the fact that we see ourselves as a community of learning rather than as a group of experts, because there are different ways of approaching strategic foresight and people have different tools and techniques. Having said that, let me just say that in answer to the question about how strategic foresight or future thinking might be different to standard scenario planning, let me share from my experience two things. One is that having worked for government and for NGOs, most of the strategic planning work that I've been involved in, including scenarios, has pretty much been limited by our existing knowledge, because few of us have had the chance to really venture into fields that we're not familiar with, or to catch up with big data or AI or deep learning or all of these other areas that are flowing around us at such a rapid rate. The second is that we very rarely are encouraged to test our assumptions or worldviews. Most of us enter these kinds of strategic planning processes believing that we know where we are and understand how the system operates, when what part of the strategic foresight approach invites is for us to imagine alternative futures, not just the ones that we can foresee, but importantly to press to understand what's really happening behind the scenes here. What are the underlying values and principles that are at play, and to what extent are we perhaps deluding ourselves that the rules that we believe are in force are actually the ones that direct and manage the system as a whole? So first, it's about strategic foresight allowing really adventures into scientific discovery, thinking outside the square, venturing into new areas, catching up with the latest information on some of the things that might happen. It's then about imagining all sorts of possible scenarios, but then finally, to me, a deciding or differentiating factor is also, with most scenario planning, we tend to be in a kind of risk mitigation approach where we're preparing for some eventualities, where in my experience strategic foresight allows us to look at the possible alternative futures and then to decide what kind of world we want and to address some of the underlying systemic issues that have to do with governance and financing and power. And so to answer the humility question, or to turn back to that and to end with this sentence, I don't see strategic foresight as a tool only for non-government organizations. In fact, the breakthrough moments that I've witnessed here in Geneva in the last couple of years have been when we've had multi-stakeholder groups in the room, because all of us, regardless of whether we're government or private sector or UN or community-based organizations, bring views of the world that shape our responses to some of these questions. And the synergy is what we're seeking, because we, all of us, I think, realize that we need to look at partnerships not in an instrumental way, but in a transformational way. That's probably more than you needed from me, but certainly I do think that foresight goes much further than a scenarios planning approach in the conventional sense. And I really would press for the opportunity for us, as I think Florence was talking about, listening. It is quite challenging for those of us, particularly coming from what might be seen as positions of power or influence, to hear other people's points of view. And so I think there is value in all of the tools that Joanne's introduced to us. Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you, Beres. I see this as a topic that really engages our participants. We've gotten a lot of interesting questions coming in. Please do keep sending those in. We'll only have time for a few of them now during the event, but we'll be following up with the speakers afterwards, as we tend to do, to ask them to provide some answers in writing to questions afterwards as well. But before we end the event, and we might need to pull over a couple of minutes here, I would like to ask one or a couple of combined questions that have come in. On the one hand, we have gotten a question from Eric in Rwanda, who's wondering, how do you think the application of humanitarian principles will evolve in the future? So then looking primarily at the core principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Will they still be compatible with the capacities you described, or will we be seeing a change in that sense? So I'm addressing this primarily to Randolph now, to come in first. But a related question as well there, the humanitarian principles being one of the main ways we see humanitarian action being defined by in the first place. How do you see the new way of working, this new initiative, that has started to take shape and become implemented as a way to, so to speak, transcend the humanitarian development divide. How would you think this will allow humanitarian organizations to better prepare for imminent challenges coming up now in the future? So on the one hand, how will we see humanitarian principles being changed? And then on the new way of working and transcending the humanitarian development divide. Over to you, Randolph.
First of all, profoundly important question, and particularly this question of humanitarian principles. And I think what we're trying to do in the Humanitarian Futures toolkit and what we try to do in terms of humanitarian futures is to say the following. We have to be far more sensitive to the environment in which we operate. That does not mean that our humanitarian principles are not correct as they are not, if you like, valid, but I do think we have to, as a community, with the emphasis on greater sensitivity, different ways of reaching out to people, begin to say, is this the way we as humanitarians are understood? Do our principles have universality in a way that we can be more sensitive to, given the way we can reach out, thanks to what you might call transformative technology? So all I can say is I would always hope that humanitarian principles are maintained. What I would hope is that the future and in the futures and the technologies of the futures can enhance our sensitivity to understanding how others see these principles. And I think that would be important. I think the issue that you raised concerning the development humanitarian nexus, I think is profoundly important. And my brief answer would be this, that I think on the one hand, what it does is to offer a different approach to take a look at the origins both of resilience and vulnerability. Development and effective development should deal with the kind of complexities that over time will make those vulnerable. And to that extent, I think that the two should have been and clearly were in the early days of humanitarian action closely interrelated. We all know the reasons why that separation occurred, and perhaps without going into that, I do hope that the determination to bring development, link it into humanitarian preparedness, prevention, is fully understood, and the capacity of identifying measures to promote resilience will then, if you like, flow into the way that humanitarian organizations also begin to prepare for the future. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Randolph, for those words there. We are running towards the end of our event now, so I will ask all of our speakers to just provide a couple of concluding remarks very briefly. But maybe at the same time, I can take the opportunity to ask a question submitted by Marie in the UK. If you could think of your favorite example of an NGO being truly innovative and thinking outside the box, and also how this might have strengthened their response. Of course, we can't get into any details about this, but if there's something you would like to highlight from an existing organization. I see Beres is deep in thought here, but I'll hand it over to you first, Beres.
It's invidious to be asked to name an NGO, but I have to say that I've been encouraged to see some of the smaller international NGOs, and by smaller I mean nothing other than their size, tending to be much more agile, faster to respond to the challenge, realizing that the world has changed fundamentally, and getting on board with some of these new ways of thinking. And as an example, I would cite two NGOs whom I know have moved their headquarters as a demonstration of how they see that organizational structure shapes our thinking. So I think that's probably my contribution.
So among some larger NGOs like Oxfam, I believe, as well now. So then over to Joanne. The floor is yours for some concluding remarks.
Well, one is thank you again for your participation and for your time. We know you're all very busy, and we really appreciate that you made this a priority and spent this time with us, and we very much look forward to your comments, not only on once you go into the web platform, but also have a look at the tools and to having you stay engaged with us so we can also learn from you. My example is an old example, and it's not an example of an NGO. It was an example of a donor agency when I worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development with OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. Now, this was back in the early mid-1980s, so I'm giving my age away a little bit. But what we did and what I was involved with, I worked with OFDA for 10 years actually, and it was an initiative that began in Latin America and then spread to the South Pacific and then to Asia and then also some to Africa. And now we would not think about this as being innovative, but it was actually quite innovative in that a lot of the work that OFDA did was to help countries prepare for disasters. So we would help them develop plans, we'd help them test them, and then we would train them. And this initiative that I'm referring to was to do all of that, but then also to train people from the region so they would be able to conduct their own training. And as a result of doing that, as I said, they started in Latin America and Central America, and then we went to the Caribbean, and then we went to the South Pacific. But as a result of doing that training and working with people, the engagement that we had with countries and in these initiatives was much more than 2 years. It went up to 10, 15 years in some of the regions. And through that became a whole network of people that OFDA had access to that they would not have had access to otherwise if they hadn't done this, who then became people this was an early initiative also at localization, because then we used these same people that we had trained to help us with response. So when you look back on it now, it doesn't seem so innovative, but it was very innovative for the time, and I'm sure a lot of you are involved with things now that are just as innovative today and will have an impact on what the work of your NGO is doing in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Joanne. And finally, Randolph, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Listen, let me put another proposition forward, and that is the whole issue of examples. I'd like to suggest two things. One is we are not talking about change per se. We know that organizations perhaps constantly change. They move directions. They go to different locations. They try and get closer to potentially vulnerable communities, etc. I think what I'm saying and what I think we're suggesting is change is recognized. But is that change really geared to dealing with the kind of crises and the threats and the types of vulnerabilities that we need to start thinking about now? Change has always been inherent in various ways in the humanitarian sector. But there's a far, far bigger change that's needed. And it's not merely shift in geographical location. Having said that, I think I'd like to end on a positive and a very proactive note. And it goes like this. I would value, and I think all of us would value, an opportunity for those who think they really are not merely changing, but changing in a way that can prepare for the ever more complex and uncertain humanitarian future. We would value an opportunity to see what you've done and how you've done it so that we, as a community, can strengthen what all of us have to offer in terms of preparing for the future. So thank you very much, Marcus. And it sounds like I might be the last one of the speakers to say something. So let me quickly say, I cannot tell you how grateful I am to my colleagues, Barris and Joanne, but also to PHAP, that has been so supportive, and certainly to listen to yourself. And ultimately, the reason that we're here is that so many of you joined this webinar. And I'd like to thank all of you. And I do hope that in one way or another, that the kinds of things that we are talking about and concern us will also be of help to you. So, Marcus, thank you very, very much for everything that PHAP has done.
Thank you, Randolph. Thank you for those very kind words. So, with that, I would ask all participants just to bear with us for 1 or 2 minutes more. There will be a small survey at the end, which is important for us for how we organize our events and getting your feedback on how we are doing. But before that, if you came in late now to the event, the audio and video recording of this this session will be available in a few days on the link you see now in front of you. You can already now click on that link and bookmark that page so you can get back to that in a couple of days. If you're registered for the event, you will receive an email notification when that is available. And then, as Liz mentioned in the chat before, we would also like to take the opportunity to announce that PHAP will be organizing a workshop, a special workshop on humanitarian futures in Geneva on the 24th and 25th of May next year. We will be organizing this with Randolph and Joanne, who will, in this workshop, be introducing in more detail these tools that you were introduced to today. You will have an opportunity to, in a very interactive way, get to know these tools and how you can use them, how you can learn from them directly, but also how you can use them in your organization. So I hope to have the opportunity to meet a few of you there. You can click on the button there that you saw to apply for it. So finally then, a big thank you to all the participants for your very proactive involvement in this session and your interesting questions. And thanks to Randolph, Joanne, and Barry's for your insight on this issue. I think we managed to both introduce people a little bit to the whole concept of humanitarian futures, while also giving them a bit more of an insight into the specific tools that have now been launched. A warm thanks to of course, all of the PHAP team here have been working behind the scenes, Liz Arnanz, Jane Lingad, and all of the rest of our colleagues here. So warm thank you to all of you, and signing off here from Geneva, and hope to see you next time.